So I want to start with an overview of the major divisions, the four major groups, and even some of the orders within those, just really a broad scale look at the plants and their family tree. I know, punny. Family tree, good name for it. Phylogeny is another name for this sort of representation to show how different plants are related to one another. So that's mainly what I want to describe here. A couple things about these. The further down we go on this diagram, the older something is. And so we start here at 540 million years ago. That's what MYA stands for. And that's where we first start to see land plants coming sort of out of the water and forming the plant kingdom. Before that, we just had algae in the fossil record. And so one of the first groups coming out at 400 million years ago was the non-vascular group, mostly the mosses. 360 million years ago, the ferns and fern-like plants. And then 320 million years ago, quite a long time ago still, the gymnosperms. And you can also see the width of these branches indicate how many species. We got 1,000 species of gymnosperms, but 21,000 species of mosses and moss-like plants. Our most recent group, by far and the most diverse, is the angiosperms up here at the top, really coming about pretty recently in terms of geologic history. And I want to walk through each of these five groups. Before I do that, let's look at a couple of other different ways of representing this family tree. And one is a cladogram, showing how the different clades or major groups are related to one another. And here we have a really simple family tree. We start with the most primitive, just the most basic model of plants, and that was green algae. And along the line here of kind of the main trunk of the family tree, we see these little dots, and those are major events that happened that gave plants new characteristics. So here we're looking at what characteristics set all of these groups apart. And so this vascular tissue applied here. So just like we have blood vessels, plants have vessels, but they don't carry blood. They carry water and nutrients up and down stems. That allows them to be taller. And so we can kind of divide this whole cladogram. Those to the left do not have vascular tissue, so they can't move water up and down stems, but all this stuff to the right does have it. So they share those characteristics. It's an important way of looking at plants and kind of a nice way of grouping them together. Developing big leaves or megaphylls was another big monumental sort of event in plant evolutionary history. All these guys to the left of that have tiny leaves, and developing more complex leaves gives you more access to sunlight. Seeds were a big invention. Everything else uses spores, so really just gymnosperms and flowering plants use seeds. They can go dormant for a long period of time and wait out some tough conditions. And then, of course, we have flowers developing pretty recently. Now, the sense of history is important, and one last thing on that is the other family trees focus on what is extant, what exists now. But plenty of plants have existed in the past but gone extinct, and that's what this one shows, like the Benetales in orange here. They existed, but then died out. They just end right there, right? So this is a timeline showing old to new at the top. We see for the gymnosperms, these guys here in light green, they've kind of been around, like those that include pines, they've been around for a while, they keep going. And the width of each of these shapes represents how many species. So in the past, they've been a little wider and more diverse. Some species have gone extinct, but they've mostly continued along pretty well. Looks like the ginkgos have narrowed down quite a bit in recent years. But the opposite is true for the angiosperms over here in green that did not exist. If you look way back in the fossil record before a quarter billion years ago, you're not even going to see anything with flowers. But they popped up, they developed some diversity, and now are definitely, by and large, the most common plants we see today. So those are just a few ways of looking at sort of the history of plants, how they're grouped, and what their characteristics are. So let's just walk through each of the four groups, starting with the non-vascular plants, and I'll show you a few examples. So here we have in the lower left, that little branch of the family tree. Remember, these are some of the oldest, most primitive ones. Ones you don't see very often are these hornworts. Strange little group. They're just this flat little piece of green, no real leaves, not a lot of different tissue, and they have this tiny little spike, looks like a horn. That's what disperses their spores. Similar to them is this group called the liverworts. There's a couple different types, but again, that flat, they call it a thallus. It just looks like this flat leaf just plopped on the ground. And then these guys have these spore-producing structures that come up that look like little branched umbrellas. So that's them. By far the biggest group in the non-vascular plants are mosses. We're pretty familiar with those. They're fairly unusual among all plants, though, in all three of these groups. The main part that you see in terms of mosses, this leafy part down here, hornworts, almost everything you see, and liverworts, this main living structure down here, actually has one set of chromosomes in each cell. May not seem significant to you, but everything else we see out there has two sets of chromosomes, including yourself. This set of plants is actually a separate plant growing on the other plant and has two sets of chromosomes, and they release spores that reproduce, and they do that in a weird way. So once in a while you'll catch these mosses with these reproductive structures, and they either produce sperm or ova, or eggs, and the sperm have to swim to the eggs, and the sperm can get splashed out, etc. And that's what gets fertilized and then results in this stalk, this sporophyte that grows up and releases spores. So spores is the method of reproduction. These guys are really low to the ground. They need a lot of moisture, both to reproduce and also because they just don't have a lot of oomph to them, no vascular tissue to get the water around the plant. So next up we have ferns, and often the rest of the groups are called allies, just things that are related to ferns. So they have a lot of similarities. They produce spores and not seeds, but they do have vascular tissue, and most of these obviously are then ferns. Looking down at our branch here, that's really one of the most thick branches, so the most species. And so we have those guys that we usually think of as growing in moist areas for some of the same reasons. They actually have swimming sperm. Strange to think of plants with swimming sperm. But they can live in dry areas like this little rock fern. And they do need moisture at certain times when they reproduce, but they can go dormant and they're fairly flexible. Some of the other weird groups, the horsetails, you've probably seen these guys, really strange groups. They put up either vegetative stalks like the one you see here, or reproductive stalks that produce spores. The same sort of thing, swimming sperm and all that. One really odd group is Phylogeny, or the resurrection ferns, and here you see it looking rather dead, just a bunch of tiny little leaves, and if you dump some water on these, they'll perk right back up in minutes and reveal their inner green leaves and kick back into action. But they produce spores just like the rest of them, and just like our last group, the lycopods, and sometimes these are called club mosses, ground pines. They'll grow in forests and also produce spores. Kind of hard to tell between them and some other groups. Not one we'll really talk about much, but they are related to ferns. As under our seed plants, starting with Gymnosperms, most of those are conifers. So we're familiar with the conifers, right? That's the biggest group by far. And really in the evergreen state here, one that is pretty common. You're familiar with the cones of conifers. They have both male and female cones on them, and that's how they reproduce. Pretty well adapted to dry habitats. And the big thing that you notice right away, they are tall. I mean, compared to everything else we've talked about, these guys are so tall because they make vascular tissue. Now, the same is true of some of their sort of distant relatives out here on this branch, which include a really strange group. One I won't really talk about much, but is worth mentioning, is this thing called Welwitschia. Grows in the Namibian desert, has two giant leaves and a bunch of cones. Strange, strange plant. Others are ginkgos. Here in Washington State, we have the ginkgo petrified forest, where we have fossils of these. They used to grow here, but now they just grow in a few areas in China natively, but we do have these as ornamentals quite a bit. They have separate male and female plants. Here you see their seed. They don't really produce cones, but nor do they produce flowers, so they belong in this group. They're a deciduous plant. So again, they're a gymnosperm, but not a conifer. And for some people, that kind of takes some sorting out. By the way, you don't want to plant a female plant. These seeds, when they drop down, really rot and stink to high heaven. Another group, not at all common here in Washington State, but you will find them certainly in Mexico in abundance out in the wild, and these are the cycads. They also produce cones and naked seeds. They kind of look like a little palm tree, but they're a different thing altogether. And then a common one in the deserts of the Southwest are these things called ephedra, sometimes called joint fir or Mormon tea. Here you see their male cones out on these really simple stems. They're just little shrubs, and they produce something like adrenaline, so they actually make this really stimulating tea that many people have used for it, for those purposes. So that's the gymnosperms, mostly conifers that we'll concentrate on here, but there's some other interesting ones to talk about. All right, so angiosperms, by far the biggest group and the most recent. I mean, I want you to appreciate how recently these came about. If land plants came about 540 million years ago, this is 140 million years ago, but they dominate the planet today. So they've really found a way to be successful. And there's lots of different orders in here, including things like ranunculales, the buttercups, like this little guy that we find all over in the springtime in Washington State. We have the group that produces daisies and daisy-like flowers, and they are an extremely common group, and a whole bunch of others. Some of them look like flowers, others don't, like this alder. These are its flowers. So there's a huge amount of diversity in the groups of flowering plants. Most of them we will separate into dicots and monocots. And actually, let me erase that here. So we have monocots, things like grasses and tulips and palm trees, orchids, and then this bare grass here. Anything that looks grass-like is usually a monocot. And it used to be that we just call them monocots and dicots, but really this whole group, more properly, recently we've started calling them eudicots, the true dicots. There are a couple other groups that used to be included there. Even though they're different, it seemed like, well, what else are we going to call them? We like two groups. But more recently, people have recognized magnolias and things like water lilies just kind of belong somewhere else. So they're kind of this funny branch. They're still a flowering plant. They're one of the more primitive groups, and they don't really concern us a whole lot, to be honest, in Washington State. So we can really still kind of talk about monocots and dicots fairly effectively. And those are our four major groups. I have followed the Angiosperm phylogeny group 4 system. Taxonomy is always changing, and so it's kind of useful to be able to know about the most recent ideas on how these plants are related. Well, that sets the stage. We'll get into more specifics later on.